Okay, here we go. A little bit hoarse right now, but we're going to make a run at the urinary system. So, nice, simple explanation of the structures and a little bit about what they do. Let's begin with the overall gross structures. A pretty simple system from a gross standpoint. We have the kidneys, and I know you can do this because we've already looked at the cat, talked about this quite a bit already. The ureters, the tubes that carry the filtrate, the urine from the kidneys to a storage tank called the urinary bladder. And finally, maybe the only part that you wouldn't be familiar with right away would be the urethra, which is the single tube leading from the bladder out of the body. Structured differently in males and females, but similar tube, similar function. Right, let's talk about blood circulation through the kidneys. We know that the what we call renal circulation is blood coming in through the renal artery. You can see that in red here. This is blood that has waste products that have been collected from every cell in the human body. Every capillary is next to cells that are producing waste products. Those waste products are absorbed by the blood in the capillaries, and that waste product then is circulated throughout the body. It doesn't leave when it gets to the lungs. Only the blood that enters the renal artery is going to get filtered. So only a small part of the entire blood supply is filtered at any one time. This is just two off-ramps, one to the right kidney, one to the left kidney. So just two off-ramps in the entire cardiovascular system. So only some of the blood is getting filtered, but some blood is getting filtered all the time. So waste products are constantly being removed. That blood then runs up into this filtering structure. You can see I've colored purple all of the tissue inside the kidney that actually does the filtration. Once the blood is filtered, then the renal veins collect the clean blood, and in that renal vein we have the cleanest blood in the human body, and that goes out. I don't know if you remember the cat, but that renal vein then enters the inferior vena cava and mixes with that blood that contains quite a bit of waste product from all of the lower parts of the human body. But the clean blood here mixing with the waste-rich venous blood makes that blood a little bit cleaner. And so there's always a certain amount of cleanliness. But you have to understand, too, that the entire cardiovascular system always contains a certain amount of waste product. Now, what about what was filtered? Well, the waste product then filters out of that filtering structure that I just colored and into these yellow spaces. And these are the collecting spaces then. If you look closely at the roundish sort of objects, they're actually called pyramids, even though they look fairly round in this picture. But if you look down at the yellow tip of those round structures, you can see little holes in that. And the urine drips out of those little holes at the tip of those pyramids, those circular structures, and is collected in all that yellow space. And so we call that the collecting structures. So structurally, you can basically divide the kidney up into its filtering structure, which I had colored purple, and the collecting structures, which are all the yellow color. Okay? Now, like all of the entrances and the exits to the human body, we want to emphasize our theme of passageways and membranes. The membranes are the places where whatever is going to leave the body is going to cross. And so this filtering part is full of membranes. Across those membranes come the waste products, and they move then toward the collecting spaces. And this, of course, are a series of passageways that then lead out of the body. And as we'll emphasize here any number of times, the inside of these passageways is technically outside the body. Once the waste products cross the membranes, they have technically left the body. They are now in a hollow space deep inside the body, but one that is connected directly to the outside world. If something that enters those collecting spaces is not reabsorbed, its destiny is to leave the human body. Now let's look at these again and emphasize that another way. Why don't we draw all these collecting spaces as they would appear spatially, designating the inside and the outside of the body. And let me take the other picture out of the way. And here they are, collecting spaces of the kidney, the ureters, the urethra, the urinary bladder. You can see that the direction to the outside world is not impaired in any way. Anything that enters the collecting space has left the body, is surrounded by the body, but has crossed the boundary and is now in a hollow space that is connected to the outside world. Okay, so let's look a little bit more closely at the actual structure of the kidney. And let's start with the collecting spaces. These are a little bit easier to deal with than the filtering structures. So we've already said that the urine comes dripping out of each one of these pyramids. You can see the little yellow areas pardon me, next to the pyramids. And those yellow spaces then have names. The little spaces next to the tip of each one of the pyramids is called a minor calyx. Two or more minor calyces, that's plural, will then unite into a single major calyx, and there could be several of those throughout the kidney. The renal pelvis is then the area that collects from all the major calyces, and that then leads into the ureter, whose line here is misplaced, obviously. Sorry about that. Should be right there where the little ureter is. Okay, so these are the collecting spaces. Pardon me, and really all it is just collecting all of that urine and running it into the ureter. Now let's look at what happens to the waste product as it passes into the ureter. If you look closely at the picture of the ureter here, you can see three distinct layers. There's an outside connective tissue layer. That's that dense collagenous connective tissue. Puts a strong outer coating on this. Then right under that, you see a layer of smooth muscle. Now what you should take from that is this squeezes and actually pushes the urine down the tube. It's not gravity that takes the urine down the tube. The muscle actually, a peristaltic motion, kind of like moving food through the digestive tube, this actually pushes the urine down and literally inflates the bladder. Okay? The ureter pumps urine into the urinary bladder. And you're obviously familiar with your bladder. You know when it gets full, you can feel that it's large and swollen. The bladder is not a fixed size that just fills, and when it's full, you need to empty it. It's actually an elastic sort of balloon-like structure that can be pumped fuller and fuller and fuller. But it is these ureters that are doing that. The inner lining, you can see there, sort of a purple color, is a many-layered epithelium a stratified epithelium that prevents the urine then from getting back out and into the body. And of course, if you want to keep it out, you're not going to have one simple little epithelium there. You're going to have many, many, many layers of cells that prevent the urine from moving back into the human body. So connective tissue, smooth muscle, and a stratified epithelium. And the urine is then going to inflate the urinary bladder. So let's go to the bladder now. Here is the urinary bladder, a hollow muscular organ that can be inflated with urine. When you look closely at it, at the floor of the urinary bladder is a triangular space called the trigone. And that triangular space is marked by the 3 openings to the bladder. Notice that the ureters do not enter the bladder at the top. They enter the bladder at the bottom. And those bottom entrances have sort of a little valve-like structure to them. And the tissue of the lining there sort of lays over the tube. And when the bladder inflates, it pushes down on the edge or the ends of those tubes where they enter the bladder, and that keeps those tubes closed unless urine is being pushed by the ureters into the bladder. And so it's not easy to back up urine back into the ureters. It's not impossible, but the 2 valve-like entrances prevent most of that from happening. The other opening is the exit, of course, into the urethra. And the urethra is guarded by a circular muscle called the internal urinary sphincter. This is a lot like your anus. It's a circular muscle that clamps down and holds the urine into the bladder. The urine is only let out of the bladder at irregular intervals. Not just in people that are trying, but in any living being. Think of an infant that knows nothing. That infant is not peeing 24 hours a day. You look at the diaper, it's dry. You look at it, it's dry. He's fussy or something, you look at it, it's dry. And then all of a sudden it's full. And of course, anybody that's ever changed a diaper knows that it can go off at any time. The child just spontaneously pees. And basically it's a reflex. When that urinary bladder is pumped full enough, when it stretches to a certain size, stretch receptors in its smooth muscle give a feedback loop, a feedback mechanism that opens that sphincter and urine comes flooding out. There is a second muscle, not a smooth muscle. All this muscle we've been talking about is smooth muscle, not under your voluntary control, but under the control of an automatic system in the body. But there is another muscle that's made out of skeletal muscle. It's also a sphincter. It's called the external urinary sphincter. And when you're taught toilet training, you're actually learning to use that muscle so that when you become aware of this internal sphincter muscle beginning to let go, you can clamp down voluntarily with your external muscle and hold the urine from coming out until you reach the toilet. So, the urinary bladder here, like the ureters or whatever, has a stratified layer of smooth muscle to squeeze the urine out when it's time, and a layer of connective tissue over it, holding it all together. Okay? So, and then there's the urethra leading out of the body. So these are the collecting spaces, the hollow spaces in the kidney, the ureters, the bladder, and the urethra. Make sure you know those. Let's talk about the structure in terms of the whole kidney, but mostly let's talk about the filtration structures. On the very outside of the kidney is again a layer of dense collagenous connective tissue, the irregular type, woven fibers that create an outer protective covering for the kidney. Most of the kidney is capillaries and fine filtering structures, very soft, could easily be damaged. So the kidney is built with a tough outer capsule. Beneath that is the primary filtering structure, which is known as the renal cortex. I'll color it here for you so you can tell what it is. It's a layer of tissue right under the capsule, running all the way around the kidney, and it's distinguished from the deeper part of the filtration tissue, which is called the medulla. Now, many organs have a cortex and a medulla. The adrenal glands that we've now seen in the cat sit right above the kidney, and in the human models, hopefully you remember this, in the human organism, the adrenal glands sit right above the kidneys. We call them suprarenal. That organ, that gland, has a cortex and a medulla, two separate kinds of tissue that produce different types of hormones, so that the adrenal gland produces several different kinds. Well, when we have two distinct kinds of tissues here in the kidney, we call the outer layer the cortex and the deeper layer the medulla. Now, the medulla can be divided into two distinct structures. If you follow it around from one side to the other, you see the pyramids. Okay? And in this picture, I see 5. That doesn't mean every kidney has 5. It doesn't. We're going to look at some real kidneys, and you'll see that there's some variation in that. Now, in between the 5 pyramids you see here is an area that we call the renal columns. And notice carefully that where the blood vessels enter, they run up through the renal columns between the pyramids in order to reach the cortex. The blood has got to make its way all the way out to that cortex in order to be filtered. And so these renal columns alternate all the way around with the renal pyramids, and that's the primary entrance for the blood vessels as they become smaller and smaller. The arteries coming in and the veins coming out. Now let's talk about this filtration. I've shown you the basic structures where this happens, but let's look at the actual little filtering structures. All of this area is made up of very small filtering structures called nephrons. The renal cortex and the renal medulla contain nephrons, and part of the nephron is in the cortex and part of the nephron is down in the medulla. Each nephron is an excretory unit. Each kidney is built with over 100,000 nephrons. And what the kidney does is actually done by each and every individual nephron. The sum total of all the action of the kidney is the action of each one of its nephrons. We see this again and again and again in human anatomy. We see microscopic little structures where there are hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of individual little structures on a microscopic level, each doing a microscopic little activity, but the sum total of them is the gross activity necessary to run a human body. Now, when you understand a nephron, you understand the action of the whole kidney, because the whole kidney is basically nothing more than what each one of its little nephrons does, multiplied by by over 100,000. So let's talk about this filtration process, and then we'll put it in the context of the nephron. Now, I want to propose to you that the action, this filtering action to get waste products out of the blood, is upside down and backwards. This is not what you or I would do, I think, if we were designing a system here. I would not have much of the blood volume leave the human body. If I was going to do this, I would probably have the blood flow down through a tube or into a chamber of some kind. And along the outside of this tube, I would have little cells that could identify and absorb waste products right out of the bloodstream, so that at one end of the tube, the blood would come in, quote, dirty, and at the other end of the tube, it would go out clean. I would keep the blood in that tube and just extract the waste products by specialized cells. That, I think, is what any sane person would do. This system in the kidney is backwards or upside down. Here's what the kidney does, or each one of the nephrons do. They take most of the plasma of the blood and throw it out of the body. They throw it into a hollow space that's outside the body, like we've talked about. That fluid then begins a journey out of the body. And along the way, cells along these little tubes take back into the human body the good stuff from that plasma, leaving water and waste products then to flow out of the body. Okay? So the nephron filters out all of this plasma. This stuff is on its way out the body. And then the nephron, the tubules that are part of the nephron, then pull the good, the nutrients and hormones and any other necessary materials back into the bloodstream, leaving the wastes to go out of the body. There's only a couple of little areas where something bad or something that's unnecessary is actually pushed out. Most of it is done like this. Now that's backwards, and that's dangerous. Because if that nephron doesn't take back the good stuff, it's gone. It has left the body. The big damage in kidney failure is not the fact that you don't filter out the waste products. Technically you do. But it's the fact that not only is waste product leaving you, but all your good stuff is leaving you. You're literally peeing most of your plasma out of your human body if certain parts of this nephron fail. This is why we do a urinalysis, right? When a urinalysis is done, you're checking to see if there's things in the urine that don't belong there, like nutrients, like hormones, like any positive thing that was filtered out at the beginning of the nephron. So we can check for those things, and they tell us that there's something major wrong in the kidney when we see materials in the urine that shouldn't be there. The only thing that should be left to pass out of the body are the waste products and enough water to filter them out. So let's talk about the actual action that's going on here. There's 3 stages or 3 functions in the urinary system. It begins with filtration, okay? And at this point, we're not identifying anything good or bad. It's just there's a filtering process that keeps the larger objects in the blood, like the blood cells and the blood proteins, and the larger things in the blood, but that lets a good deal of the plasma pass out of the blood. The second step is reabsorption. You've got to get the good stuff from that filtrate back into the bloodstream. And that leaves then the waste products to pass out. Just before it's leaving, though, there is some balancing to be done with various minerals and ions that are in the bloodstream. And if there's excess amounts of ions or minerals or whatever, those things can actually be pushed out of the blood and into the waste product filtrate, leaving the blood not only clean, but balanced for any number of ions and minerals. So, all of this action then, the filtration and the reabsorption, takes place in the nephron. And here's one up close. Notice the artery leading the normal blood into the nephron, and the blood then coming back out minus some of the plasma. This structure that you see, this rounded structure with the little capillaries in it, is called the renal corpuscle. The renal corpuscle. And that knot of capillaries in the center of it is known as the glomerulus. The glomerulus is where the filtration occurs. Let's look at it a little more closely. Okay, here's the glomerulus. It's made up of sinusoidal capillaries. This is partly why we gave a lecture on the blood vessels a little while ago. The little capillaries that are found here in the renal corpuscle are called sinusoidal capillaries, and they leak a lot. Remember, continuous capillaries don't leak. Fenestrated capillaries have small pores in them that leak. Sinusoidal capillaries have large pores in them. Now, they're so large that lots of things could pass out. So these sinusoidal capillaries are covered with other cells called podocytes. And you can see they sort of have a fringe on them. And these cells then meet and create some slits. And so what we have is between the sinusoidal capillaries and the podocytes, we have a filtration membrane that lets an awful lot of the plasma out, and it collects in that yellow bag-like structure you see around the glomerulus. And that area around the glomerulus that collects the plasma is called Bowman's capsule. Okay? So we have a renal corpuscle composed of the glomerulus and Bowman's capsule, and this is where filtration occurs. We now have plasma with its good and bad passing down through the tubule connected to the capsule. Now, each one of the tubes that you see here is going to be a part of the reabsorption. Everything except that last one, the collecting duct. Let's take these in order. The fluid first passes into the proximal convoluted tubule. Now let's define that before we go too far. Convoluted just means twisted, twisting and turning. And you can see in the picture here that the tube is not straight. It has lots and lots of bends in it. And it can have many more than this or fewer than this, but it's always a bit twisted. Now in this convoluted tubule, the most important things are reabsorbed. The nutrients and things like the nutrients, vitamins, minerals, things that are very, very important to the human body are reclaimed first. And the filtrate has got to wander quite a ways down through this tube, so there's plenty of time for the cells lining that tube to pull the positive things out of it and back into the bloodstream. From the proximal convoluted tubule, you can see it leads down into a loop, down into a hanging loop. And you can't see the entire loop in the picture. It's called the loop of Henle. And the loop of Henle is the balancing site. This is where ions and minerals and other substances that are hard to manipulate leave the tube and re-enter the tube. This is also a site for excretion. If there are any excess amounts of these, they can be pushed out into the tube. And so after the fluid flows down through the tube and back up through the tube, as it enters the next part, all the positive things have been taken out of the filtrate. It's been balanced for its ionic nature, benefiting the blood. And now really the only last thing to do is then take as much water as is necessary out of the remaining waste product. And that is done in the distal convoluted tubule. The distal tubule is responsible for extracting the right amount of water. Now notice I didn't say the maximum amount, because sometimes your body is totally hydrated. Sometimes the human body doesn't need all of the water that's in it, and it will let some water pass out. If you've ever seen or paid attention to your urine in the toilet, there are times when it's very, very yellow, very, very concentrated. And there's times when it's somewhat dilute, when it's sort of a pale color. That's just telling you not how much waste product there is, because you're always constantly producing the exact same amount of waste product. But what that's telling you is how much water is with that. If you have a fixed amount of waste product and very little water, it's going to look very dark. If you have a fixed amount of waste product in a lot of water, it's going to look pale. So this distal tubule is responsible for that. We have chemicals in our world, and sometimes they're taken to eliminate water from our bodies. They're called diuretics. Caffeine is a diuretic. And these chemicals act on the distal convoluted tubule here and cause it to not absorb more water. And that, of course, then leaves more water than would be needed to pass out of the body. And this has hormonal and nervous regulation that is constantly monitoring the amount of fluid in the body and retaking as much water as is needed to keep the body hydrated. By the time it's passed through that, everything that's going to be done to it has been done. And now, as the fluid flows into the collecting duct, it is destined to leave the body. And you can notice here in the picture that several nephrons are all going to join and enter a single collecting duct. These collecting ducts are then passing down through the renal pyramids and end on the little end of the renal pyramid, and drips this urine into the collecting spaces. So that's the structures here that are functioning in this simple urinary procedure. The blood supply, you can see here, the two horizontal blood vessels, the big ones in the picture, are passing through the inferior part of the cortex, or just superior to the pyramids. You can see the arteries flowing into the glomerulus. Notice that no oxygen leaves there, that the blood is still oxygenated as it passes away from the glomerulus. That wasn't the purpose of the glomerulus. The purpose in the glomerulus was filtration. And now the little capillaries flow all over the tubes, around the capsule and all the rest of the tissues, and bring oxygen so that all the cells and all of their tasks have the oxygen that they need to do their job. You can see that these are also, the blood vessels here are absorbing the plasma or the filtrate back from the tubules, and all of that is re-entering so that the venous blood here is very, very, very clean. Okay, so this is sort of that microscopic circulation. We saw the macroscopic circulation in the structure of the kidney. So, nephrons are removing waste and balancing the blood. Okay? What the kidney does is really what's done in miniature by each nephron. Hundreds and thousands of nephrons. Notice one more time, the cortex contains all the capsules, convoluted tubules, both the distal and the proximal ones, are all up in that cortex area. This is where the major blood flow is. Down in the pyramids, down in the medulla, because this medulla portion right here is the pyramid. And notice the loop of Henle and the collecting ducts all flow down through. The tip of this renal pyramid is called a renal papilla, and that little nipple-like end is dripping urine right out of the kidney, or right out of the filtration structure and into the collecting spaces, which, the moment that filtrate crosses the glomerulus, the membranes of the glomerulus, it has left the body. The only thing that saves us is that those tubules there reabsorbing the good stuff so that only the wastes and some water are left to pass out of us. Okay? Reaffirming the blood supply in the kidney here, renal arteries lead in. Those arteries run up through the renal columns to the cortex. From the cortex then, and filtration, the veins are collecting the filtrate that is run down through. Up in the cortex, the blood was filtered and balanced, and back down through the columns, back down through the renal veins, and out of the body. So, we've talked about the structure of the kidney, the structure here of the nephron, and those urinary collecting and storage structures. Make sure you know these structures, and you'll know the urinary system well. All right? Have a profitable time studying this.